everybody. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Wave if you can hear me. Hello, nice to meet you. Frank is here. He just, here he is. And he and I will be the only people who are unmuted. If everyone else can mute themselves, that would be great. You might want to change your computer to speaker view so you can see either him or me bigger. And thank you so much for all coming. I'm just going to wait a few more minutes and let a few more people join in, come in. There's still people joining us, so you know, we can just keep chatting a little bit, Frank and I. You guys can listen in, or I just want to make sure everybody's here before I start.
This is a scary number of people.
Yeah, on Zoom.
Well, I've been to, book launches in New York that have had fewer people than this at them.
Oh, well, yeah.
I mean, if you don't include the PR people and the marketing people and the people from your own publisher, you know.
Right, exactly. Me too. Me too. So here comes some people from the French Morning and Frenchly team. Hi, Maggie. I just saw your name. So people are still coming on. Let's give it about 5 more minutes. Hey, Kamal.
Hey, Kathleen.
Hey, Maggie. If people want to show me, hi. People want to show me your faces, I'd love to see you.
We're getting it together here.
Oh, good. Well, you and us both.
Now.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Thankfully, none of you will have to endure my passive smoking.
Oh. But we like watching you smoke.
It's one of the great things about Zoom, is I'm allowed to smoke at these things, and people go, "Oh, I remember when people used to smoke." But at least I'm not bothering anyone but myself.
Funny. I think there might still be people coming on, but we'll give it a couple more minutes. Hello, Margot. If there's anybody else here who I haven't said hi to, who knows me, welcome. It's really exciting for me to see some of your faces, since I write to, the great unknown. So it's exciting. So Frank and I were just talking about the trials and tribulations of publishing and writing books. And we can't wait to talk more with you guys too. So a couple more minutes.
So on a quick hands up, who has read this book in the original French and who has read it in English?
So, okay, wait, hands up for everybody who's read it in French. Not me. So those of you who have. And did anybody read it in here? There are 2 pages, Frank. You have to go through and look at the 2 pages of people.
I am.
Oh, okay, good. And what about who's read it in English? Oh, there's Andrea. Frank, Andrea, say hi, Andrea. Hold on, unmute yourself for a second.
Hi.
Andrea wrote the review for Frenchly about The Art of Losing. I'm going to send it.
I read that. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, no, I read all my reviews. I only sometimes pretend I haven't if they were bad.
I just sent it to everybody. Andrea wrote that. She's a writer in her own right, and is writing for us sometimes, which is great. So I'm going to keep letting people come in, but maybe we should get started. What do you all think?
I think you should get started.
Let's get started. Okay. So if this is your last chance to go grab a glass of wine or a cup of tea or an ice water, and then come sit back down. Here, I'm still letting people in. This is very exciting. My gosh, if only you all will come to any other event I do. This is so fun to have so many people. I hope you all will come back. Okay, I also have a couple of links I'm going to send people. So I sent you all the review that Andrea wrote last winter. There was a piece in the New York Times about so as you all know, the last Saturday was the 60th anniversary of the Evian Accords that ended the Algerian War. And in France, the legacy of this war is not unlike that of the American Civil War in America. And so that's one of the things I'm interested in discussing. I want to send this piece to you all from the New York Times. And then I also want to share this really interesting podcast that's it's called Sauce Algérien, and it's about being Algerian in France. And so if you're interested in any of those are on your screen right now. So welcome everyone. I'm really excited to try this and see how it goes. I see my Uncle Jay. How are you? And this is really fun. So welcome, Frank. Thank you so much for joining us. Frank is a translator of French and Spanish books, also some Portuguese. He can read Catalan, Portuguese, and Dutch, as well as French and Spanish, obviously. He published a book called I Was Vermeer, which was his own novel, and is now judging the Booker Prize this year for translations. Welcome, Frank. Thank you so much for coming. He joins us from his native Sligo in Ireland. And
I'm sorry that Alice can't be with us, but Alice is currently doing a one-woman show in Paris. So she has always been both a writer and a performer. And at the moment she is doing a 1 month gig, doing a 1 month show, one woman show in Paris. So she's not really free in the evening anymore.
Yeah, I'll actually, when in a few minutes, I'll send you guys the link to her one woman show. I found it after you told me that, Frank, and it looked really interesting. That's a good point to remember. And she's young, right? She's written all these novels and she's quite young.
She is very young. I mean, this is her, well, what I've translated is her third novel. She has published a fourth novel since then. What is interesting about The Art of Losing specifically is that while I think it's always dangerous to equate the author with their narrator, she is of Algerian descent, and this is the only novel that she has written that deals directly with Algeria and the idea of Algerian inheritance within France. I mean, her first novel was called Gloomy Sunday, from the song of the same title, and was set in Hungary, which is where the song was originally written and recorded. Her second novel was set in France, but did not in any sense feature anyone of Algerian heritage. What was very different with this novel, and we'll talk more about this in terms of how it's structured and so forth, is that whether or not pieces of it are autobiographical, it does nonetheless mirror what her heritage is. So that in France, if you are the son of North African immigrants, you are in slang terms referred to as beurre, which is verlan. So what you do is you take the two syllables of Arabe, and you invert them. So instead of Arabe, it becomes beurre. And then if you are third generation, you are rebu, which in turn is an inversion of the syllables of beurre, and she is rebu. She is third generation of Algerian immigrants who came in during the whether you call it the Algerian War or the War of Independence, rather depends on who you are.
Ah, that's a good point. So Frank, I have some questions for you, just basic questions like, how do you become a translator? How does one become a translator? I know you've lived a slightly peripatetic life, and you started in Ireland, you lived in France, you lived in Spain, you lived in London, you lived in South America. But how and when did you become a translator? You were already a writer.
I became a translator somewhere close to my 40th birthday, entirely by accident. There is no infrastructure. There is now. At the time that I became a translator, there was no infrastructure. There were no universities teaching translation courses. There were no support networks for emerging translators. You fell into it by accident, and I fell into it by accident. When I left Ireland to live in France, I was a bookseller. When I moved from France to London, I ran a small bookshop in London. Part of that included the fact that I stocked bande dessinée, what in English we would now call graphic novels, though the term did not exist then. As a result, I got to know a number of publishers, because this was the very brief period in sort of in the sort of early 1990s when American and British publishers were interested in European graphic novels. I translated a number of graphic novels and ended up working in publishing graphic novels and comics for many years. I spent quite a bit of the 1990s and into the 2000s building the internet, for which I apologize, because despite all the communication we can indulge in, it also involves a lot of trolling by almost everybody. And in the background, I did a certain amount of other translation. I also did something. So for a publisher to acquire a book from another language, most British or American editors do not read in a second language. Or if they do, I mean, they're not going to read in a third or fourth or fifth language. So, they get sent novels from Germany, France, Norway, Korea, wherever. And so they have a series of people that they use who write what are called readers' reports. So they will send a book to you. They know you, they feel that they can trust your taste or whatever. Now, in part, what you're doing is describing the book to them, but that's not terribly important. I mean, they can find out what the plot means quite easily. What they really want to know is how well you think this might work in English, whether you think it would sell, but how important you think it is, what the possible comparisons are, not only to other books in that language, but to books published in English in the first place, where it would sit in the list of titles they're planning to publish. So I had done that for about 5-6 years for 2 or 3 separate editors. And you get sent a lot of books, usually around the time of the London Book Fair and the Frankfurt Book Fair in October. And with an awful lot of those books, you would write a reader's report that said, this is what the book is, this is what it's about, this is why I like it, this is where I think it is. And then you have to eventually summarize. And more often than not, you end up saying, I'm not sure. I think it's a bit small. I think it's a bit French. I think it's a bit insular. I think that an English audience might not understand it. In 1997, I read a novel, a very short novel about the first Gulf War, called L'hypothèse du désert by Dominique Sigaud, and I wrote a very positive reader's report, and I said, I think actually this is something seriously worth considering. And the editor in question acquired the rights to it and said, would you like to do a sample by which you mean, translate a sample of a couple of chapters based on which we will make a decision as to whether we think you can translate the whole thing. So I did, and the editor was happy, so I translated the book. It was, in terms of its sales, it was not hugely successful, but it was shortlisted for a prize or two, and it was a New York Notable Times book that year, and that was the beginning of, I'm really reluctant to call it a career in translation, but that is the beginning of what I did in translation. It was another, I don't know, 5-6 years before I gave up my day job and decided I might be able to make a living from this, because translation is not terribly well paid. In order to survive as a translator, you would have to translate somewhere between 4 and 6 books a year.
Oh, wow.
This means you have to be offered at least 4 to 6 books a year.
Right.
So, that takes time, and it takes time to build. And so at the time when I eventually decided to become a full-time translator and left the internet bubble just before it burst, I thought, well, I can't afford to live in London if I'm doing this. So I moved originally to Central America, to Costa Rica. And then I lived in Argentina for a couple of years. I spent a lot of that decade living in South America, Latin America. And as a result, I acquired Spanish and eventually began to translate from Spanish around about 2010. So that was a much later addition to what I was doing.
Gilbert, do you have there's somebody has a hand up. Is that right?
Gilbert certainly has a hand up.
Yes, I don't know what I do with his hand up. Gilbert, do you want to unmute yourself and tell me why you have or write a message in the chat here for me and tell me why you have your hand up? Frank, in the meantime, while we wait for that, so how many books have you translated in since 1997?
I don't exactly know, but somewhere between 85 and 100.
Wow. Okay. So backing up a little bit, like, what is the first thing you do when you get a manuscript?
The first thing you do is read it. And people, this would seem to be really, really obvious, but actually, there are translators who like to discover what they're doing as they go along. I don't. The first time I read a book, I want to read it for pleasure. I want to experience the pleasure that a reader would get from this when they're not thinking, what would I do with this? And how would I do this? And how am I going to deal with this tricky pun or this reference to something that nobody will know anything about? Initially, I think the most important thing is to get a sense of what it feels like to just read the book and enjoy it. Once you've done that, you have a sense of, you then read it again. And when you read it a second time, you're beginning to think, well, okay. There are lots of books that are deceptively simple, which is to say that you pick them up, you read them, you're dragged along from beginning to end, and you think this is amazing and I'm really enjoying it and whatever, and you're not paying attention to the details of what this might involve when you're trying to bring it into another language. So, humor is difficult, dialect is difficult, a lot of cultural references are very difficult, but you're not thinking about those. The second time you read a book, and before you begin translating it, you're beginning to think, how would I deal with this? What sort of voice do I need to create for this? How do I deal with the humor or the irony or the sarcasm or the different voices that individual characters have? And once you've done that, you begin a first draft. There are a number of ways to do this, and translators do it in very different ways. I do a very intensive first draft. I will iron out a lot of the very difficult problems. So for example, in The Art of Losing, as with any novel that has a historical basis, there's quite a lot of research that you need to do.
That was my next question. How much did you have to learn? Did you know anything about the War for Independence?
Oh yeah, quite a lot, because I've translated a number of other Algerian writers over the years, and I have translated a number of other novels about the Algerian War of Independence. So this was not new to me, but the specifics of various bits, and particularly because this is not set in, say, in Algiers or in Oran or wherever. This is set in Berber country in the south of Algeria, which is very different. I mean, not just the country is very different, but the Berber people are very different. They speak a different language. They are not necessarily predominantly Muslim. They are not straightforwardly integrated into what people think of as Algerians, who are largely Arabic and who are largely Muslim and who are almost entirely Arabic speaking. But with any historical novel, I mean, with many novels that even are not historical, there's an amount of research that you need to do, because you cannot translate something that you cannot understand. I need to understand it at a much greater level than will ever appear on the page.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're reading a novel, you know, if you're reading one of Hilary Mantel's novels about Thomas Cromwell, if you're reading one of Gore Vidal's novels about, you know, historical novels about the United States, there's an amount that can wash over you and you find out things as you're going along. But if you want to translate that,
Mm-hmm.
you need to understand not only what it says on the page, but what is behind what it says on the page. So you need to know what. I mean, I cannot even now remember how I managed to translate before the internet, because if I'm describing the streets of Algiers or Cadiz or Buenos Aires or whatever, I can hop onto the internet and I can, you know, I can look up historic photographs, or I can use Google Street View and actually think, okay, well, this is where this is, and this is where that is, and this is what that looks like, and whatever. And I can get a really in-depth sense. I mean, before that, you just made an awful lot of notes to yourself while you were doing your first draft. And then you went to a library and you looked it all up. Because, you know, what else are you going to do? I mean, that was, you know, libraries were the internet for, you know, the entirety of time until the late 20th century. So you had no choice but to do that. But it's an important, it's a hugely important tool. And it is that much more important when you are dealing with, I mean, I have translated both novels and nonfiction works that are related to the Holocaust or to collaboration in France during the war, or to the dictatorship in Argentina, or to Castro's Cuba. In all of those cases, it is my responsibility to know what I'm talking about before I even begin. Because, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. How much time did that take with this book? How much time did you spend after your first and second read, then doing research so that you felt like you could start to understand what you were doing?
In this case, maybe only a couple of months, because quite a lot of the broad brush of the Algerian War of Independence was something I was familiar with. I've translated a number of novels by Boulem Sansal, who is Algerian. I translated a couple of other novels that are directly set during the War of Independence. What's interesting, as I said, with what Alice is doing is that this is set in a part of Algeria that I'm not familiar with. I mean, I haven't been to Algeria for 40 years because it's kind of tough getting there these days, and even tougher to move around. Even if you can get there, you need, you know, permission to go into the backcountry and into what would be called Kabylia, which is the Berber territory inhabited by the Kabyle people. So yeah, I mean, there's maybe a couple of months of research that requires doing, so that you know what the backstory to the individual events is, because I mean, Alice has done her own research in this into specific events. I need to know what those events are, and like her, I mean, she puts on the page the bits that she thinks are important, but she knows more than that. I need to know almost as much as she does in order to be able to replicate that. It is not just knowing the difference between the ALN and the FLN and the various factions that were involved in the war on the Algerian side, and also not simply understanding who the Harkis were, but what their relationship was to other movements within France at the time, and the relationship between the ALN and the independence movement in Egypt at the time, all of which are dealt with in the novel, but not in great depth. But I still need to understand who all of these people are, what they mean, what we call them. And I mean, frequently, you're dealing with events, some events are events for which we have a name. So in English, we have a name for the Battle of Midway or the Battle of Britain or whatever, which in French would have different names, and in Spanish would have different names and whatever. But there are also, battles for which we have no names because they didn't directly influence us, meaning English-speaking peoples, because they were fought between, I've had similar issues translating novels set in Indochina, which was historically a French colony that involved not only Vietnam, but Cambodia and most of Laos. And there too, I mean, there are things which the average French person would immediately recognize that an English reader will not. So originally, the country that is now called Vietnam, and which was part of French Indochina, was divided into 3 provinces, which were Saigon, Annam, and Cochin. And so in France, you will still regularly refer to people as being Annamese. Now, that is an English word, but most English people would not associate it with Vietnam, but it does refer to the Vietnamese people of central Vietnam. So a lot of, we tend as readers and as individuals to be more interested in the history of our own country, and then subsequently of those countries that are neighboring, and those countries with whom we share a language. We are much less likely to know something about, wars that are fought in foreign countries between 2 countries that we have no. I mean, memorably, when I lived in Central America, I discovered what is called the football match war. So a war between Honduras and El Salvador that began during a football match that they were playing against each other, when the football match degenerated into a riot, and the riot degenerated into a war between 2 countries. Most people outside of Central America would not have the faintest idea that there had ever been a war between 2 countries in Central America triggered by a soccer match. Who does this?
Right. I have a question for you, and this is sort of I wonder what, here's a quick question, and I also want to open this up to other people because they are here for the last 15-20 minutes. But a quick question is, so if you take on a big book like The Art of Losing that has a lot of research, and you're trying to do 4 or 6 books a year, are your other books easier? Like they're,
Yeah.
just
Yeah. No, the only way you can do this is by pacing yourself. So there are easier books. There are books that, I mean, either they're set within a territory and a world, if you want to call it that you instantly understand. But also I've translated a fair amount of French and indeed Spanish crime fiction or whatever. I mean, I genuinely enjoy crime fiction. It's something that I've always enjoyed. But usefully it plays by certain rules, and therefore actually translating it is much more straightforward. You know, I mean, you have to have spent, you know, the last 40 years of your life watching Law and Order. But, you know, if you've done that, you know what it sounds like, you know how to pace it, you know how dialogue works within such things. So yeah, I mean, not all of your books can be extraordinarily exhaustive and deeply, you know, I mean, I've just started translating a book which starts off for the first 99 pages as a perfectly reasonable, you know, in perfectly standard French in the present time, more or less. And then round about page 99, there is a banquet scene which lasts 100 pages that is written in 17th century Rabelaisian French with lots of references to Rabelais.
Oh,
That takes a fair amount of work to do. I mean, not just rereading Rabelais, but also recreating a voice for this and whatever. You know, the same will be true, say, of, you know, Jennifer Croft translating the books of Jacob. The books of Jacob is largely set in 18th century Poland. So it's not about simply translating the language that's on the page. It's having an understanding of what 18th century Poland was, how it worked in terms of its regions and dialects and what people believed and so on and so forth. And it involves very frequently the use of some form of historic language that is not one's own. I mean, part of the deal in The Art of Losing, in the first third of it, Papa's Africa, Papa's Algeria, is that it draws on imagery, mythology, and legend of the Kabyle people. And A, you need to understand that, but B, you need to render that in an English that is significantly different from the third section of the novel, which is when Naima goes to Algeria, because she is a straightforwardly, you know, independent young woman, 21st century. She's convinced, you know, she knows who she is. What she doesn't understand is where she's from. But the voice that you're using there and the type of English you're using there is fundamentally different from what you were using to describe Ali growing up in Kabylia. I mean, both before and after the olive groves, but also you then need to, you know, the language that he uses and that is used around his fighting for the French in the Second World War and the shift to France in the late 1950s, early 1960s, is important. You know, one of the things that you do is that you have an etymological dictionary to make sure that actually the word that you want to use was in common use at the time, because if it wasn't, you really shouldn't be using it. Language evolves over time, and English has evolved much more in the past 120 years than French has. The sort of slang that is used in French now is not significantly very different from what would have been used in 1920, whereas in English it is. It's very, very different. And therefore, the way that the formality with which people speak in French seems to have shifted rather less. But when you're translating this into English, Naima's voice needs to be that of a young woman in her late 20s in, you know, the early 2000s, and that of Ali needs to be that of somebody who, even before he was an immigrant, was a peasant farmer in, you know, a rural outpost of the French Empire.
Have you ever, this will be my last question and then I'll open it up to other people. Have you ever been translating a book and said to yourself, oh my God, this book needed a better editor. If only I could do a little of this and a little of that, make the book a little better. And what happens if that occurs to you?
Okay. Yes, it has occurred to me. It has occurred to me often. Both French publishing and Spanish publishing very generally hark back to the sort of 19th century idea of the artist as a lone genius, and you don't ever tell them what to do. There are lots of both French and Spanish novels from various places where the author doesn't have enough self-discipline and the editor is not prepared to impose any. But the work you do as a translator is to bring a text that already exists into another language. So you do not get to edit it. There are times when you feel a translator's job is to perform, not to improve. You know, if I were talented enough as a pianist to be able to play the Goldberg variations, I don't get to change the notes. I get to phrase it differently. So from that point of view, no, you don't do that. There have been cases where I've gone back to an author, and this is particularly true of historical books. I've gone back to an author and said, you know, you're dealing with, you know, an aspect of the Shoah or whatever, and you've said, you know, I don't know, there was a novel in which the original French said, you know, they were transporting Zyklon B gas in canisters. And I said, actually, this is not how Zyklon B was transported. It was transported as pellets, which were then added to a small amount of sulfuric acid, which then created the gas. And I think it is important, given that we're dealing with something as important as the Shoah, that we be absolutely accurate as to what our terms are. Mostly in such circumstances, you know, your author will say, thanks, I wish my editor had pointed this out to me. I mean, actually in The Art of Losing, at some point I said to Alice in my notes to her, I said, why is it that, like, for 30 odd pages, her boyfriend is called I can't remember, Thomas, and then he's called something else? She went, oh God, I never noticed that nobody corrected that, you know. So, and that's fine. Or, you know, when I was doing Pierre's first novel, which is a crime novel, Pierre Lemaitre, his first novel is a crime novel. And I said, there's a real problem here, you know. I mean, the initial crime seems to take place on the 6th of April, the 7th of April, and the 8th of April. We have to actually stick with one of them. It can't be all of them, you know. And some of this is just insufficient editing originally. But the only things I would go back to an author with, I mean, okay, so I've recently done an interesting book, which is tangentially about the Shoah. So it's by a French author. It's called Le Ghetto Intérieur. And it is by someone whose grandparents were from Poland, who moved to Argentina before the Second World War. But much of their family remained in Poland and died during the Holocaust. And whose and his generation then, his parents' generation then moved from Argentina to France during the dictatorship of the 1970s. So in fact, he is writing in French about people living in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in the 1930s, who in turn came from Poland. So part of the conversation I had with him was, this needs to sound more as though it's in Buenos Aires. I need to have more bits of French in there. I've lived in Buenos Aires. I need to have bits of Spanish in there, but also you have characters who arrive from Poland and you know, you're referring to them using French versions of Spanish versions of Yiddish names. So actually, you know, if he's called Moishe, he needs to be called Moishe and not Moshe or Moise or, you know, whatever. I can't give him a French or a Spanish name. He has literally just arrived from Poland. So he would be known by the name he was known in Poland, which would be the Yiddish Moishe. And again, this wasn't a problem. If you go to an author and say, this is why I'm doing this, most authors understand that what you're really doing is saying, for this to work, we need to be clear about certain things. But no, what you don't get to do, only once have I ever said to an author, this whole scene is terrible. I suggest we get rid of it. And the author said, yeah, you're completely right. It was my first novel. You know, it was a long time ago. If I were to write it again now, I probably wouldn't have put it in there. Yeah, let's get rid of it. And it was just, I mean, it was a very powerful, very emotional novel. And then there is this scene of a guy driving down the road, you know, to get to, you know, the woman that he desperately loves. And he can hear his voice inside her head. And the stuff that's going on inside her head that she is saying sounds like a Hallmark movie or possibly even just a Hallmark card. And I said, it's terrible because it not only takes me out of the moment, but it makes me feel less tense and, you know, more inclined to laugh. This is not good. But yeah, editing takes various forms in various places around the world.
So I'm going to open it up now to everybody else. Thank you, Frank, for answering all the questions I was sending you. We have about 15 more minutes. There aren't that many of us here. I think if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question, things that you know, I'd like to that I have not asked, in case you want to ask Frank about any of these. He's, you know, a judge for the Booker Prize, and this year has read 137 books in order to long and then shortlist those for the books in translation. He wrote a novel, which I don't know anything about and have not read, but want to, called I Was Vermeer. And I also want to know, Frank, if you ever feel like answering this, or anyone else wants to ask this, you know, if somebody else wants to become a translator, what would you tell them? But don't answer that yet. You can do that later.
I mean, you see, if none of these people ask questions, I'm going to actually like shout out individually to Maggie McNally and to Françoise and to Andrea and, you know, force them to. Okay,
ask some questions, people. Look, someone just said, I just ordered I Was Vermeer and was looking forward to reading it. And somebody else said, there's another question here. This is not a translation question. How accurate is it to equate the Harkey with Nazi collaborators?
How to equate what with Nazi collaborators?
The
Harkeys. That depends on where you are. Of course, the Harkeys were those who, for whatever reason, chose to fight with the French in Algeria to keep Algeria part of France. They were absolutely despised in Algeria. And I mean, as Alice points out in I Was Vermeer, I mean, her character Naima, when she's researching going to Algeria, you know, gets trolled online by people saying, you Harkey bitch, I'll cut your throat. From the point of view of the Algerians fighting for independence, the Harkeys were traitors. They sided with the oppressor against the idea of independence, which is precisely, of course, what the collaborators in France did under the Vichy regime, was to side with or work with the Nazis during the occupation of France. Now, in doing so, Some of them did it to stay alive or to keep their families alive or their friends alive. They didn't necessarily believe in it, but there were others. I mean, the great French writer Chateaubriand was a very vocal supporter of the Nazis in France during the Second World War, and as a result was tried afterwards and executed.
It looks like my uncle Jay has a question for you, Frank.
Yeah.
Actually, Caitlin, it's primarily for you. This has been extremely interesting, and I am thrilled to know a lot more about Frank and his background, and I have a lot of questions about that. But maybe that's some other time. We haven't really gone deeply into the book. Can we have another 1, 2, 3 sessions on maybe a quarter of the book or a third of the book each time? I'd love to do that.
The book deserves so much time. I don't know. I'll think about it. I've chosen another book for our next book club. I mean, I'd love to hear you all talk together a little bit about the book in the next few minutes, or with Frank, and ask him questions about it. Because I, like you, I mean, I loved it. I especially, Frank, loved the section of the book about Ali, the whole part that took place in Syria, and then them coming to southern France and then to Normandy. I absolutely loved it. And here's somebody else who's writing in and says, this gave me such an aperture into the translating. Really enjoyed your perspectives, talking about your next book club book. How can I submit a book for your consideration? Just email me, William. Actually, I think we're going to do this book next. It's called The Anomaly. It was a bestseller in France during the pandemic. Frank has read it.
I have indeed, and I expect it to be turned into a Netflix series. To get back briefly to Alice, the great problem with the Algerian War in France was when France fought very hard to keep its empire, initially in Indochina, from which it withdrew, and then subsequently in North Africa. And Algeria was the last of the colonies that it lost. Part of what was difficult about it was an entire generation of young Frenchmen were sent out to fight there, not necessarily very well. I mean, they behaved rather badly. There was a lot of torture and coercion involved in the Algerian War. But the deal that was made when the war ended in 1962 was that everyone was pardoned. Now, this meant that the Algerian partisans who had fought and who had planted bombs in cafes and bars and whatever were pardoned and would not be prosecuted. But in exchange for that, the French military, who also committed atrocities in Algeria, would not be prosecuted. And for a very long time in France, it was referred to as the Silent War because nobody talked about it. The first novel about the Algerian War probably comes in the late 1980s. And then there were a handful after that. Before that, nobody wrote about it, either because they had people who had fought in it, or because they just observed this sort of code of silence that everybody behaved badly, let's not say anything more about it. And of course, the Algerians who came to France in the 60s, many of whom were Harkis and the others were what were called Pieds Noirs, which were French people who were born on Algerian soil, were excluded from the French community. They were encouraged to learn French, be French, stop being Muslim, stop speaking Arabic. And of course, part of Naima's problem in this book is that that's what has happened. Her father, Hamid, has broken from his parents, educated his daughters in French, educated them to be free and independent, but therefore cutting them off entirely from the language that he spoke, the history that he lived. And of course, you know, as Naima says more than once during the novel, his only comment about the war in Algeria or the Second World War was the war. It was just 2 words. He said nothing more about it to them. So nothing was passed on. And therefore there is the difficult lesson historically of attempting to go back and reconnect with the people who have various opinions about who your father or your grandfather or whatever was about which side they took in the war, about which you know almost nothing, because they have chosen to say nothing to you. I mean, feeling that it may burden you or whatever. And that is true of so many wars. I mean, it has been true after the wars in the Balkans between Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia. It has been very much true in my own country, in Ireland. I mean, the Civil War in the 1920s and early 1930s is one of the founding myths of the Republic of Ireland, but one about which we didn't talk for a very long time because, you know, it divided families. I mean, literally, you had brothers fighting against each other and fathers fighting against their children. There is no more pernicious war than one that turns people against themselves. And that's very much what this is.
Well, obviously, we're seeing something similar right now in the world. Does anybody else want to ask a question? I felt it was so interesting reading this book, you know, when my heart was breaking about Ukraine and the situation there. And then the middle part, so moving, of Ali and his family and then leaving, and the refugee, being a refugee. But please, anybody else, would you like to join in? Yes, Christine, unmute yourself. You can all unmute yourselves. It's a small enough group, and if we talk over each other, it's okay. we'll just wait.
Thanks. I love your newsletter and I love all this that's happening. Sadly, I didn't read the book, but I did get the British version. So I'm happy to be reading that. I just have a quick question. Was there a draft in France? Like when you talk about the French that went over during the war, was that obligatoire, like le service?
Oh, no, it was absolutely obligatoire. Yes, no, I mean, there was a draft.
Right.
So until 1995, everyone in France had to do 2 years of military service. If you were a conscientious objector, then you had to do 3 years of coopération, which was humanitarian aid. But no, the draft existed in France. The French forces who fought in Afghanistan, only a very small proportion of them were volunteer army. Most of them were conscripted.
Anybody else want to join in?
Kathleen,
Yes. Salut. Hi, friends.
can I? Hi. Okay, I was born in Algeria.
Where?
And I left there when I was very young. But my father was very much for Algérie Française. And when I was 17, during the war, I think he was involved in some of the events that happened in Paris. He never talked about it, but when I've read the book in French, and what interested me is that this was the other side, the side of the Algerian people. That I was not aware of. I was a teenager during the war. So this brought to life these people, especially the way they were treated when they came to France, which was horrible.
Now, what is interesting
And
is,
so I found it very, very interesting. I also knew French people who had to leave with a little suitcase,
Hmm?
who had to leave Algeria and left everything, just like it happened in Morocco. I lived in Morocco also.
Yeah, yeah.
The same thing happened in Morocco. Well, you just left, just like what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Right.
So
They
it was,
left everything.
it was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, so many of the French people living in Algeria would have stayed, but felt they couldn't, and they left. I mean, there are, when we were looking at covers for the English edition of this book, there were many that I suggested, and one of the most beautiful, well, one of the most heartbreaking, is the French families who are arriving in Marseille with nothing but one
Yes.
suitcase between
Yeah.
three of them,
Yeah.
leaving everything they owned. And of course, you know, in the case of having lived both in Algeria and Morocco was worse, because many of the French moved from Algeria to Morocco and then were forced to leave Morocco, so they were dispossessed twice in terms. But yes, I'm also very interested in what you say, and there is no French novel yet that has dealt with the French side of this, which is the Algerian bombings in Paris during and just before and during the war. I mean, there was a terrorist campaign carried out by the FLN on the mainland in metropolitan France, which is what triggered this in the first place. And there were many people affected by terrorist events in France, which of course had very little to do with France and everything to do with Algeria. And depressingly, and you would perhaps have been too young to realize it at the time, but the betrayal that the French felt by de Gaulle,
Oh yes, definitely.
you know,
yes.
From the moment he originally says, "Je vous comprends," which of course French Algerians took to mean, "I will stand by you, I will be with you." And then
Exactly.
he walks away from this, and it means that he's abandoning. And of course they felt betrayed, and they should have felt betrayed. He did what was useful for him. And in doing so, I mean, there were many ways in which the occupation of Algeria or the colony of Algeria could have ended up. But the worst possible way was the way it did. And in part, that was because de Gaulle said, "We'll fight to the end." And then he said, "Okay, fine, have the country."
Yeah, he kept saying Algérie française. And
Vive l'Algérie française. Yeah. No, and then suddenly it was like, fine.
I remember.
Yeah. But I mean, the trouble is but the trouble then, as you discovered, is that, you know, when the Algerians who had to come, the Harkis, the Pieds Noirs, and so forth, were met with graffiti that said, "Ici on voit les Algériens." And of course, as far as the French were concerned then, everyone was Algerian. The Pieds Noirs, the Harkis, it didn't matter.
Oh, yeah.
So, no, it was...
And you know, it's interesting. I live in New Jersey, and a couple of houses from me, there is the daughter of Pieds Noirs. They first went from Algiers to Marseille. Then they stayed in Marseille for a couple of years. And because they had an uncle here in the United States, they came to the United States. And she's living a couple of houses from me. It's, you know, it's interesting.
It is. It's very interesting. Thank you, Françoise.
Thank you, Francoise. Christine, did you have a?
Yeah, I just had a quick thing. So I am French, and my parents came here in 1961. And one of the things my mom used to say is she called it la crise algérienne, and they would put bombs in mailboxes. So she said one of the reasons she loved coming to New York was she never had to worry that before she would cross a street and she was standing next to a mailbox that it could, go off. And the crise algérienne was really a thing in her life. It was frightening to be in Paris.
Oh no, it would have been terribly frightening to be in Paris or Lyon or Marseille. I mean, there was no organized Algerian army. It was not as though they could have fought a war against the French. They were an underground movement, and they did what they did, not only through, terrorizing and oppressing people in France, but also terrorizing and oppressing people in Algeria who did not want to become, so actually, if you were not with them, then your whole, the reason that Ali in the novel chooses a side and chooses to work with the French and be what eventually became called a harki, is because he has already had the FLN show up in his village and kill people and threaten to kill more people, if this didn't happen. And, unfortunately, the old style French mailboxes, which were rather like American mailboxes, you pull down a handle and put stuff in, were ideal for bombs. No, I mean, it was, no war is ever going to be, there is never a war where everybody is good on one side and everybody is bad on the other. Well, except possibly in the Ukraine at the moment, where I'm finding it difficult to find bad Ukrainians, but maybe we will. But no, I mean, it was a very ugly war. The French who were there, who had been there since, I mean, admittedly only about 100 years, but felt they had a right to be there in the way that the British felt they had a right to be in India, that they had a right to be in Burma. That in fact, in my father's time, that they had a right. I mean, my father was born when Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom, before the 1916 Rising, before the Civil War, before whatever. All of these countries thought they had a right to be there. And, who the F were, these uppity little natives telling them that they wanted to rule their own country. But unfortunately, the horrors of war spare almost no one. And the innocent suffer much more than those who are, I mean, one of the most famous corporals serving in Algiers in La Maison Blanche, which was a house used for torture of Algerians in Algiers during the war, was Jean-Marie Le Pen, who subsequently went on to have a very long career as a vile racist thug. But, nobody ever suggested that he go on trial or that he be, I mean, he literally spent, his early 20s torturing and murdering people. This isn't, this isn't news to anyone. But nonetheless, you could come back from that. You could be, part of the political system in your home country, even though you had done this. And of course, what he would have said is what they did was much worse. And of course, everyone says what they did was much worse. Unfortunately, history is written by the victors. What's interesting about Alice's book is that there are no victors in it.
Right.
The French feel guilty, the Algerians who went to France feel guilty, the Algerians who stayed at home feel guilty.
Yeah, it was a very humanizing book. It humanizes all sides. I really love that about it. I'm cognizant of the time and Frank's time. So how about 2 or 3 more comments or questions? And then we can say goodnight and do this again next time. Maybe Frank will join us again.
I will happily join you again.
I just want to say, I really enjoyed the book. And one of the things that it also made me think of is Asia Jabar's L'Amour and Fantasia, where she talks about how women's history of Algeria has never been told. It's always the male perspective. And I appreciated that she brought in more of the family perspective, but both.
No, I think that's hugely interesting. I mean, I've translated a number of novels. I mean, possibly as many as 6 or 8 that involve Algeria or the war in Algiers, and not a single one of them has had a major female character in it. And I don't mean even contemporary. I mean, it's not just Naima, but it is Yema. I mean, part of this, I had a small fight with my American editors because they didn't understand. There was something they didn't quite understand when we were doing proofs. They said, well, you know, would Naima really refer to Yema by her first name? And I said, Yema is not her first name. We don't even know her name. Yema just means mother.
Right.
She is married as a child bride to Ali as his second wife. And the moment she gives birth, she becomes Yema, mother. And then everybody refers to her as Yema. But that is not her name. She has no name. She is not even given that. All of her family, her children, her grandchildren, all refer to her as Yema. In fact, you know, including people who are, of course, not her children. But that is, I mean, it is supposed to be an honorific. It is supposed to honor her. But of course, it erases her completely. It means she is not an individual. She exists because she is a mother. And of course, Ali rejected his first wife because she could not give him a son. And to fail to give him a son meant that she was not worthy as a mother. And, you know, this is part and parcel of, no, I mean, not just of Muslim culture or Algerian culture, but used to be very, very common in Christian British culture. I mean, the fact that, you know, if you are, you know, in line to the British throne, and you happen to be a woman, but you have a younger sibling who is male, they get to be king. You don't get to be queen unless they die.
I've been having to explain that to my older son because we're watching Downton Abbey, and there's that whole issue there. There were two, you brought up a really good point that Jennifer and Frank, there's that wonderful moment in when and a neighbor say to each other something like, you know, we were never asked, a female neighbor, we were never asked if we wanted to come. We were never asked what our feelings were, what our story was. We just went. But by the same token, I say that what I really loved, Frank, and I don't know if this is the book does this itself or this is mostly your translation, how you did it, but I loved how in the beginning, you don't really like Ali that much, or, you know, as a Western reader, but you come to really love, I came to really love and sympathize with him. And he became my favorite character, the truest character in the book for me.
Well, the great problem is that Ali is always true to himself. He sees life in very simple terms. I mean, he sees life in terms of mektub. It is written, fate. And one of the hardest things in the book is Hamid's rejection of his father. Now, yes, Hamid has had to do a lot of growing up. He comes to France. He's a child. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know anyone. He ends up having to translate, not only for his parents, but for the neighbors, and fill in their tax forms and do whatever. But by the time he marries, he's embarrassed to bring his girlfriend to the HLM in Normandy. He's embarrassed to be there. He never teaches them or gives them any insight into Arabic or Algerian or Algeria. Now, Algeria, he barely knew. He was 11, 12 when he left. But Arabic, of course, he did speak and spoke fluently. It was his only language with his parents, but he does not pass this on. Now, Ali is I mean, it is both Ali's great quality and also his great tragedy that he is always true to himself, and he thinks that all people will always be true to themselves. He cannot understand that the French people that he fought alongside in the Second World War now want to kill him. He cannot understand why the Algerians that he has supported and lived with now want to kill him because he's taking a pension from the French army. He can't, I mean, he just looks at the world and thinks, I don't understand. I have tried to be strong and I have tried to be loyal and I have done what you have asked me to do. And I'm caught. And, you know, what he does is he retreats into silence. So it becomes his burden alone.
He's a terrific Shakespearean character.
Yeah.
Character. I'm guessing he was based on, was he based, I mean, was he totally made up?
I didn't ask because there are things that is important not to know if you're translating. I assume he's based on her grandfather.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
Yeah.
I suspect logically he's probably based on her grandfather and a couple of other men of that generation whom she knew that she blended together. But I didn't want to know while I was translating it. For me, he is completely understandable. You know, he is the son of a peasant farmer who happens on an olive press as it's running, you know, as it's flowing down a river, and they manage to get it, and it completely transforms their life.
Yeah.
But every piece of mektub, every piece of fate that transforms his life, he is powerless against. So whether it is becoming wealthy, whether it is, you know, the beginnings of the Civil War, whether it is going away, whether it is, he is, you know, I mean, when he tries to not bring Hamid to the factory where he's working in Normandy because he doesn't want him to see that what he's doing is this sort of minor repetitive task that is underpaid and whatever, he is trying to instill dignity in his son. He wants his son to want better. But unfortunately, wanting his son to want better is precisely what means that his son will eventually reject him.
Yeah.
And spend less time with him and spend less time going to visit Ali and Yema. No, I mean, he is, what I like about him is that what I like about what she has done very generally is that these people are human. They are complex, they are flawed, they make poor decisions. Naima makes a lot of poor decisions. And she's, you know, our 21st century, I am the person in the present day who will tell you everything. She's not trustworthy. She doesn't know what she feels about Algeria. She doesn't know what she feels about the married man that she's dating. She doesn't know how she feels about, I mean, the only thing she knows what she feels about is art. And even then, she's reluctant to take on an Algerian artist because she's reluctant to discover some aspect of herself that, or some aspect of how she feels that would contradict. Interestingly, all of the other, so at the start of section 3, when she talks about the various exhibitions in the gallery they've had, because again, you go away and you research this, all of the other artists who are mentioned, not the Algerian artists, but all the others are real artists, not under their actual names. But the Swiss photographer and the, you know, so on and so forth that she talks about, these are all real people. These are all, you know, you can look up their works and see what it is that she saw in them. And of course, what is fascinating about her eventual fascination with the Algerian artist is that most of what he does is not what she's used to, which is installation art and large spaces and huge canvases or big photographs. They're doodles on napkins. They're tiny little drawings that she has to pry away from him.
Oh, I loved that. I could really see those, and I loved
Yeah.
what they were. I loved that aspect of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else want to ask? It's really late for Frank because he's in Ireland. Is it 12:15 there, Frank?
Yeah, we're at bedtime o'clock here, so if you've got
So
anything to say, now is the time.
comment or question, and then otherwise let's say goodnight, and we'll meet again in a couple of months for our next book club. Yes, Jane. No. Oh, does anybody have a question or comment?
Merci.
Just want to say thank you. It was really terrific.
Merci
Yeah,
à
that
vous.
was really great.
Merci.
Oh, let's all say thank you and goodbye. Good night.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Night.
Goodbye.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you, Frank. I'll be in touch. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye. Thank
Well.
you.
So great to see you in person.
I love your newsletter.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I love it.
That's how I found out about it. It's great. Thank you.
I love writing it, and I love that you came.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Do this next, everybody. The anomaly.
Okay, great. Okay.
So look, you get to see my office. This is where I write my newsletter.
Oh, it's so pretty. Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Bye. Keep in touch.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.